Vintage clothing has exponentially grown in the last couple of years, but is the process of buying and selling vintage clothing actually sustainable? Big up everybody, Spencer Lyon here. For those that don't know, in 2012 I set up a brand from my bedroom called Gullygarms, clothing specialising in vintage and second-hand. In the last year, I unfortunately had to close it due to COVID, Brexit and a lot of other issues behind the scenes, but I wanted to come back and I wanted to come in a capacity where I could give you value on what I've learned, because I think it's only right to get it out of my head and pass it on to other people who are in the industry. And today I wanted to go for a topic that's quite controversial to some degree, but also a very extensive one, so I'm going to be as thorough and concise as possible. Is vintage clothing selling actually sustainable? Now, for those that don't know, vintage clothing refers to typically items of age. My personal definition of it is items that are older than 20 years. Yours may be slightly different, but that is a metric that I follow to keep me in tabs with whereabouts I think vintage is. 20 years to typically anything before Y2K, so 2000 and before. Now, it's important to know the definition, or a loose definition, of vintage clothing to be able to understand the sustainability approach from this conversation. The way that vintage clothing is actually sourced and collected creates the biggest question for whether that approach is actually sustainable. And just for complete layman's terms, the word sustainability means maintaining something without depleting resources that won't be able to be replenished as a result of it. So when we look at vintage clothing, something that's defined by an age, so essentially it has to have been in circulation for X amount of years, is now being sourced at an incredibly fast rate due to an incredibly high demand into the buying and reselling economy. I don't blame people. Everybody was stuck indoors for a few years and they wanted to set up their own brand. I get it. But as a result of this massive trend of interest into the vintage clothing, what it's meant is wholesalers are absolutely depleted of vintage clothing. You think about how vintage clothing comes around. People donate their clothes and then it's defined by vintage with the people who sort them in the rag houses or in wholesale units. Not only that, but the thing with vintage is what's happened is, as a result of lots more people actually selling it, those people that would have been donating it to charity shops or taking it to clothes banks have probably got their grandchildren or people within their family, even themselves maybe, selling it and reselling it. What made vintage a bit of a sweet spot, say in 2015, is that because the demand was so high and the supply was a lot lower, is that wholesalers could actually suffice replenishing all the stock with the people that were buying it to resell. And a lot of people that sell vintage clothing know that it's never just specifically vintage. Secondhand is a byproduct of all vintage clothing anyway. But in 2015, it might have been a much higher percentage of vintage clothing at a much more reasonable price. You know, the economics of supply and demand. If people want a product, the price goes up. But as a result of it going up in the retail, it also goes up in the chain dramatically. The prices of buying premium vintage now have absolutely exceeded what people were probably trying to retail those said products in 2013, which tells you that wholesalers have even more leverage than the resellers did in 2012, like myself, who was selling it at the same price that they might be selling it at wholesale. Don't believe me, honestly, I will show you some of the prices of wholesalers, and with due respect, I totally get why that ecosystem of price has risen. But I want to centralize back to the point, and this is looking at vintage clothing, and is it actually sustainable? In short, no. Vintage clothing cannot be sustainable when there's a demand higher than a supply, but also the way that people used to source vintage, or how it used to be collected, is a much lower number, because those people that they would source the clothing from are now selling themselves. That might be a little bit more of an assumption point there, but I guarantee you that's happening a lot more now than it was 5 years ago to those people who would have been giving their vintage clothing to charity shops, to waste bins. So what does this mean for resellers? Well, it means realistically, if you are a purely vintage clothing seller, then you shouldn't be worried, but you should look to diversify your business and your brand. So in the last couple of years, even when the brand was going on its last leg, I was trying to pioneer a second-hand movement more so than a vintage. And the reason why is because the second-hand process of buying and selling clothing, for an example, is sustainable. People will always be donating clothes, there will always be items that you can find, and they're not always going to necessarily be vintage items of clothing. The value of second-hand as a means of being sustainable is going to go up. People are going to be aware that the process is sustainable, they're supporting a circular fashion, and also vintage is just going to skyrocket even more. As the demand increases and increases and increases, and the supply reduces and reduces and reduces, there's going to be a battle of the wholesalers taking the price up as high as they can until the point where resellers won't buy it. You will have resellers buying products and selling it for really high prices. Like I tell you right now, for example, when the industry was actually popular in about 2015, you would sell branded vintage sportswear sweatshirts for maybe £35 to £50. Now you can go on Depop and Etsy and eBay and you can see those same products anywhere between £90 to £150. And I genuinely believe that those people reselling it on Depop and stuff may have some element where they don't understand parts of business, and that's only a presumption, but my other thought process would be that they are having to pay a lot more for those individual items as a result of their scarcity of volume availability. Even in 2013, it took me ages to find suppliers that would sell me branded sweatshirts. I had to take lots of different lines, but as a result, I was always taking lots of other products with the vintage. So how does this point connect, and how can we kind of summarize this to give a conclusion of what you can take from this? To reiterate that same point, if you are a purely vintage seller, I would just question maybe trying to diversify your brand ethos, maybe looking at some other brands and some other approaches that you can apply to it. The secondhand element might not be for everybody, but I believe that that stigma that sits underneath it is kind of ironic, considering there's a big demand globally for vintage clothing when vintage is secondhand as well. It just has a different level of desired nature because perhaps influences through celebrities or whatever it is. But how does this end? If it's unsustainable, there's going to get to a point where there's going to be none. The point of what's going to happen is that the prices for the supply at wholesale are going to go to exceeding amounts, and when it gets to breaking point and the people that are trying to resell to buy to resell are not buying it at that price, then they will have to reverse back on the food chain of it. I think the best process, honestly, is to start integrating non-vintage into your vintage now, so that you aren't watering it down, but you are adding a little bit. You might be somebody who has a store and sells purely 1980s Nike, Adidas, Reebok Champion sweatshirts. All I would say is to consider maybe looking at 2000s to 2010s branded sweatshirts, or trying to diversify with more secondhand items of that element. By doing that, you smoothen the plane of which you are working within, and if everybody actually does that, then there will be more vintage and the distribution of it will last longer. The issue that we've got right now is that suppliers are selling specific vintage grades to specific customers at premium prices and creating an unsustainable construct, because those said products are at a limited supply if it's sold as a complete vintage entity. Now, Spencer, you said that vintage is a subjective word and that it's things that are older than 20 years. So essentially every 20 years there's a recycling of new clothing. Yes, that's very true. There are, and that is another argument to take on with it. At the rate that it's being supplied and being drawn and drained out of the actual wholesaling ecosystem is too quick for the ability of people buying it to resell. I mean, it's an obvious thing, isn't it? If the prices have gone up, it's because the demand has gone up on the other side. It's not too complex to understand that. But what I'm saying right now is, in order for vintage to not just be a word that we use like a trend word and it's gone in the wind in a moment and a matter of time, if you are just a vintage seller, how are you going to diversify your market to extend out of that? People that have vintage in their title, how are you going to expand out of that brand identity that you have? These are certain elements that I would be looking at considering, especially now for in the next 5 to 10 years, with how the ecosystem of things will change. Everyone's got different suppliers. The world is a big place and lots of items of clothing were made back in the day. However, the way that vintage is sourced is by a process that is very high on the resources that's needed, the labor intensity that's needed to actually cohesively create enough material, enough textiles through vintage to actually supply to a wholesaler who supplies to a distribution of resellers. So just consider that. When you're thinking about your vintage brand and you're thinking about what you're selling, look at how you can maybe integrate the secondhand element or maybe different parts of it into the ecosystem of it. Because like I say, it's a bit silly to be just a purely vintage company and preaching sustainability, because essentially that's not how it works and that's inaccurate. Again, guys, I welcome any feedback. Please challenge me. Please drop a comment and give me your 2 pence, your 2 cents, your opinion. I want to hear it and I want to know what you think about what I've said. As always, guys, I'm here to try and help. I'm here to give value on what I've learned and from being in the industry for 12 years, how I see things playing out. My opinion reflects my own judgment of things and my expertise of what I've actually learned. Stay safe, stay sustainable, stay doing you, and stay original. It is a good thing to stay original. Big up, guys. Lots of love, and I'll see you soon.